Hello, and welcome to our first set of lectures, or our first lecture on the renal system. And in this session, we are going to look at the basic overview of the structure of the kidneys and also the main functions of the kidneys, focusing on what's happening in health, but also just touching on what might go wrong in disease. So when you know what's going on in health, you can often work out what is happening in basic disease states. So the first thing we want to look at is the urinary system as a whole. And I just want you to look at the arrows, look at the image with the female on the left, male on the right, and just what is the name of each of the structure that the arrows are pointing to. It's nice and simple. So top arrow, kidneys. Okay, so the kidneys has multiple functions, as we'll talk about in a second. And one of the key ones is the formation of urine. And when the urine has been formed, of course, it passes through the ureters and down towards the bladder where it is stored until it's time to urinate. And that urine is passed out through the urethra. And so the urethra, just so you know, and I think you probably know it anyway, is quite a lot shorter in females. And this does mean that females are more susceptible to urinary tract infections. This is infections that normally start in the urethra, often coming from vaginal or anal bacteria, making their way up the urethra and towards the bladder, leading to those urinary tract infections. Infections can move up through the ureters and towards the kidneys as well, but more often than not, they are retained or they remain within the bladder, leading to the symptoms of urgency and frequent urination and small amounts of urine being passed. And finally, looking at the right-hand side again, which is the male, what's the structure that the arrow is pointing to? Hopefully you know that is the prostate gland. Okay, and we're not going to deal with the prostate in this session. But of course, if you get prostate enlargement, that closes on the urethra, meaning that the flow of urine, it decreases. Okay, so let's think about how the kidneys are actually structured and how they're receiving the blood, which they are then going on to filter and process. So, of course, if we're looking at what sits on top of the kidneys, you've got the adrenal glands, one sitting on both kidneys. And the adrenal glands have a variety of functions, but one of the key ones is the production of hormones, which have a variety of roles, but they produce, for example, adrenaline, which is part of your fight or flight response. They produce aldosterone, which is involved in your blood volume and your blood pressure regulation, cortisol, which is your long-term stress hormone, and then your androgens, which are kind of inverted commas, the male sex hormones. So basically a weak version of testosterone that both males and females produce within the adrenal glands. So where is blood coming from? Well, blood leaves the aorta from the left ventricle, of course. It makes its way into the renal artery, which you can see here, and then that makes its way through arterioles into the kidney itself. When blood is coming out, it's coming out through the renal veins, then back into the vena cava, the inferior vena cava in this case, and then back towards the heart. So that's nice and simple structure. And in this image, you can see the ureters that are coming down as well. Okay, so that's where the processed urine is and making their way to the bladder. So I want you to press pause at this particular juncture and have a think about what you know about the kidney physiology already. So what do you think the main functions of the kidneys are? So a key one that I just mentioned is all involved with water balance, so water homeostasis and plasma volume. So it's involved in regulating your blood volume and therefore your blood pressure over the longer term. But what are some of the other functions of the kidneys? Press pause, have a good think, and then we shall go through them. Okay, so hopefully you've had a good think about what's going on. So it's involved in water balance, plasma volume. So related to that, it is maintaining the extracellular fluid osmolarity. Osmolarity is just the concentration of everything in your extracellular fluid. Of course, your extracellular fluid is your blood and your interstitial fluid mainly. So your interstitial fluid is the fluid that surrounds your cells, so it's in your tissues. So osmolarity is what everything adds up to. So it maintains sodiums and potassiums and chlorides and glucoses and bicarbonates, all manner of different things. And it helps to maintain that osmolarity and the regulation or the amount of each of those ions in our extracellular fluid. It's involved in acid-base balance. So it helps to maintain the number of hydrogen ions that you have in your blood. So it'll excrete hydrogen ions in the urine if we become a bit too acidotic, so it'll get rid of that acid, and it'll retain hydrogen ions if we need to retain the hydrogen ions. For example, if we become alkalotic. It also regenerates bicarbonate, so that's your HCO3, and that is important in buffering hydrogen ions. So it's really inherently involved in our acid-base balance. It's severely or significantly involved in calcium regulation. So parathyroid hormone is the main hormone, or the main hormone that acts on the kidneys itself in terms of this regulation. So it stimulates calcium reabsorption in the kidneys and it stimulates phosphate excretion. So it's helping to do that. But just as importantly, parathyroid hormone acting on the kidneys activates vitamin D. And vitamin D works on the gut to absorb calcium and phosphate. So as a summary of that, what you're having is PTH is secreted when your calcium levels are low. It stimulates calcium reabsorption in the kidneys. It also stimulates calcium reabsorption through the bones, but we're not really focusing on that too much. The other thing that it does in the kidneys is it activates vitamin D, which leads to calcium absorption in the gut. So there's a whole cycle going on there in calcium regulation. We've already talked about how it regulates blood pressure, and it does this by maintaining plasma volume via a variety of hormones that act on the kidneys that we'll come to at a later session or a later date in this one. It helps to correct for anemia. And so if you become anemic, so you've got a low red blood cell count, for example, the kidneys detect reduced renal oxygen levels, and then they go on to stimulate the release of a hormone, EPO, or erythropoietin. And EPO, released from the kidneys, goes to the bone marrow and stimulates red blood cell synthesis. It's involved in protein catabolism, so it helps to break down and remove waste products such as urea, and of course then excretion. It's removing your toxins and your metabolic wastes. So it's actually got a vast array of functions, some of which you may not know about. So then if someone has kidney disease, so chronic kidney disease, which is long-term kidney disease, all of these things over time start to go wrong. And so all of these things in terms of treatment, we need to treat. So the key thing that is happening in your kidney physiology, it helps to maintain the composition of the extracellular fluid. So that's your sodiums, your potassiums, your hydrogens, your bicarbonates, chlorides, etc. Maintains ECF volume, electrolyte composition, and overall osmolarity of your extracellular fluid. So therefore, it's homeostatic regulation. That is a key feature of what it does, along with the elimination of potentially toxic metabolites and foreign compounds. For example, drugs that might be metabolized, we need to excrete them somehow. And as a general rule, we need to produce about 500 mils of urine per day as a minimum to enable us to excrete all those waste products. So our urine can only get up to a certain concentration. Okay, that's about 1200 to 1500 milliosmoles per litre. So that's the concentration of everything in it per litre. And to get rid of everything, we need to have about half a litre. So let's have a little bit of a think about the function of the kidney itself. Now, the kidney itself weighs about 300 grams. So that's 300 grams for each kidney. And it receives about 600 mils of blood each minute, which means the two kidneys together get or receive about 1,200 mils or 1.2 litres move through the renal artery. So here's your renal artery. Remember, that's come from the aorta, comes through the renal artery, passes through some arterioles into our nephrons, which remember are the functional units of the kidneys. And at this point, we start to filter that blood and we make about 100 mils per minute of filtrate. So that filtrate passes into the tubular components. Okay, so here you've got the proximal tubule, which is the first part. And that is your glomerular filtration rate, the amount of filtrate you're making in the glomerulus per minute. So, like we said, that blood is coming in through the renal artery, it radiates and starts to form into what are called the afferent arterioles. These are the ones going into the glomerulus itself. Okay, so these afferent arterioles then within there turn into capillaries and are filtered in that glomerulus. So the glomerulus is that ball of capillaries. And that's where we form our filtrate, about 100 mils per minute, remember. The remaining blood leaves through what's called the efferent arteriole. Okay, and then that efferent arteriole goes and wraps around the tubular components of the nephron itself. So you can see it here wrapping around the tubular components in what's called the peritubular capillaries. And these peritubular capillaries have a very important role. They are supplying the renal tissue with blood and therefore nutrients, so oxygen and glucose and everything else that they need to live. So if you don't get enough blood coming through your peritubular capillaries, the kidney cells aren't getting enough blood and nutrients to be able to survive. So those peritubular capillaries have an important role. We'll talk about the other roles in a second. They then resegment, as you can see following this image, into the renal vein, and then the renal vein goes back into the inferior vena cava and back towards the heart. So how do we regulate the amount of filtrate that we actually form? Well, we'll talk about this in a later session. But really, we change how much blood is coming in through the afferent arteriole through either constricting it or dilating it. So if we have afferent arteriole vasodilation, we're opening up the arteriole, more blood is coming into the glomerulus, so we can filter more blood. So that helps to regulate that GFR. We can also do through the fine-tuning mechanisms, we can vasodilate and vasoconstrict the efferent arteriole. And we get dilation and constriction of both of these under different situations, whether we're fine-tuning them or in emergency situations, such as your fight or flight response with big amounts of blood loss. There are different responses that happen because of different hormones and different mechanisms that are involved. And we will talk about that at a later date. But the key thing to think about, really, if you're thinking very simply, is the afferent arteriole is the primary regulation thing, because this is bringing the blood into the glomerulus so we can vasoconstrict and vasodilate it. And then the efferent kind of does the fine-tuning. If you want to think it simply, it's not quite that simple, but it's a nice way of thinking about it. So we're going to have a little review question. So what I'd like you to do is just read this question and then think about what you think the answer is. I'll give you a second to think about it. So a 25-year-old man loses a large amount of blood following a motor vehicle accident. His blood pressure falls and the sympathetic nervous system is activated to preserve circulating blood volume. Remember, sympathetic nervous system is part of that fight or flight response. And as part of that fight or flight response, key thing is getting blood going to your brain, to your heart, and to your lungs, especially when you're losing significant amounts of blood like this. Other organs become unimportant. So what change in renal arteriolar tone, so that's how much vasodilation or vasoconstriction, is most likely to occur, and what is the effect on GFR, so the amount of filtrate that is formed? So have a look at those options. What do you think the correct answer is? Hopefully you've come up with C, preferential constriction of the afferent arteriole causing a decrease in GFR. Remember what I said. Your sympathetic nervous system has kicked in because you've lost a large amount, or this person has lost a large amount of blood. The kidneys become unimportant at this point, as does your gastrointestinal tract and your gut and your reproductive organs. Completely non-essential in this life-death situation. So therefore, looking at the afferent arteriole, here's your image, it vasoconstricts. Less blood is coming in, which means more blood is able to go to those essential tissues. And if there's less blood coming into the afferent arteriole, the amount of filtrate you form also decreases. So you get constriction of the afferent arteriole, which causes a decrease in your GFR. So we've already said, we've talked about the nephron being the functional unit. We've talked about, here's your renal artery, here's your afferent arteriole coming into your glomerulus, and your efferent arteriole coming out. This you can just follow where the arrow is pointing here. So it's getting a little bit more busy. And then you've got these peritubular capillaries that are wrapped around all of your tubular components. They're wrapped around what's called the proximal tubule, so it's close to the glomerulus, the loop of Henle, which dips into the kidney itself, the medulla part of it, and then you've got your distal tubule here, okay, where you get some fine-tuning going on. But these peritubular capillaries are really important. Like I said, they are delivering nutrients to the renal cells to allow them to live and to function, and they are also secreting substances into those tubules that we don't need and reabsorbing substances from that filtrate that we do need. So they have a really important role, bringing back what we need and kicking out what we don't. And then, as we just talked about, we also talked about the sympathetic nervous system and what might happen in blood loss. So therefore we know that there is a nervous system involved in this, and it's the sympathetic nervous system. And it's this renal nerve that innervates individual nephrons. And that can adjust the rate of urine formation and glomerular filtration by a couple of things. So we already talked about how it alters blood flow at the afferent arteriole in particular, but also it works on the efferent arteriole. But when you get that sympathetic activation, it also stimulates the release of renin from this little region. It's called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And this little region, you can see here, it's basically the whole series of cells. It's a little region with a whole series of cells that are detecting what is going on, both in the afferent arteriole here, at the level of the efferent arteriole here, but even more importantly, what is in the tubule at the later stages. So this is the distal tubule. So it's basically measuring what's in here and then talking to the afferent and efferent arterioles and telling them what to do. Okay, so that's what's happening at that point. So simply put, what we've just covered are the vascular components of the nephron. Okay, so we've talked about the afferent arteriole, the efferent arteriole, and the peritubular capillaries. And then we just touched on the juxtaglomerular apparatus, talking about how that's an area where there's communication, this monitoring what is actually present in the filtrate and adapting what's going on. So now we're going to think about the tubular components of the nephron. So here's a nice image again. So here's our glomerulus. We've got an afferent arteriole and an efferent arteriole. This is your glomerulus, which is your ball of capillaries, and the filtrate forms into what's called the proximal convoluted tubule, or just the proximal tubule is nice and easy. And so when you form this filtrate, how much was that again? It's about 100 mils per minute. Hopefully you remembered that. Most water and solute is reabsorbed in these proximal tubules. We form the filtrate, but most useful things are reabsorbed in this proximal tubule. And so remember, our GFR is about 100 mils per minute, so we make 100 mils of filtrate every minute. And of that, 70% of the sodium and potassium is reabsorbed. And as that is reabsorbed, the water follows by osmosis, so therefore 70% of the water is reabsorbed. In health, if you're not diabetic, all of the glucose is reabsorbed, and all of the amino acids that have also passed through there are reabsorbed. So we've reabsorbed, in essence, 70% of everything in our proximal convoluted tubules. Everything that is useful, I should say. The things that we don't want, we don't reabsorb. So the filtrate volume has decreased, okay? But the osmolarity of the filtrate and the blood are the same. And remember, osmolarity is just the concentration of everything added up. So the concentration of sodium and potassium and glucose and chloride and bicarbonate, everything, the osmolarity is exactly the same. So the concentration of everything is the same in the proximal convoluted tubule as it is in our blood. So what volume per minute of filtrate enters the loop of Henle? So if 100 entered into the proximal tubules, we've taken 70% of it out, 30 mils per minute is now entering the loop of Henle. And as you can see, the loop of Henle dips into the medulla here, and you can see it here. So here's one nephron, and here's the proximal tubule and the loop of Henle dipping into the medulla, and here's a longer one going into the medulla. These longer ones can reabsorb more water and make the urine more concentrated. So you might think that in humans, we've got a wide variety of these, of variety of lengths. So some dip just a little bit, some dip a lot. But in desert rats, for example, they all dip really long into the medulla because they want to reabsorb as much as possible because there isn't as much water around. Anyway, back to it. We've done the proximal tubule. The filtrate at 30 mils per minute is now entering the loop of Henle. And the loop of Henle has two parts to it. It's got the descending limb, the one going down into the medulla, and the ascending limb, the one going back up and towards the cortex. So wherever you see cortex, it's the outer part. So the renal cortex is the outer part, for example, and the the cerebrum cortex is the outer part of the brain, for example. So the cortex is that outer bit. So looking at this, loop of Henle, the descending limb is permeable to water, but not to most solutes. So therefore, water leaves the tubule by osmosis. Okay, so concentrating the tubular fluid. So water is leaving, so coming into the medulla, okay, and that means what's left in the loop of Henle, or the descending loop of Henle, is becoming more concentrated. In the ascending limb, the bit going up, the opposite happens. It's impermeable to water, but sodium potassium chloride are therefore transported up. There are transporters that transport them out and back into the medulla and into the cells and then into the blood. So what's happening at this point? Because salts are removed at this point without water, the tubular fluid becomes more dilute. Now you might go and think, well, you're making it more concentrate, and now you're making it more dilute. So really, what's the point in that? But really what's happening is you're overall making it, the filtrate, more concentrate. So yes, you're doing different things in different parts, but overall it's becoming more concentrate. And the reason, or a key part of this, is that the loop of Henle allows the kidney to control water and salt independently. And that is absolutely key to what is happening there. It's got that independent regulation. So we've now concentrated the filtrate as it comes into the distal tubule, or the distal convoluted tubule. And this is basically where we have a lot of fine tuning. Okay, so this is where the hormones act. So the hormones that act on the kidney, or most of the hormones that act on the kidney, work in this distal convoluted tubule and in the collecting ducts. And they fine tune to what the body actually needs. And the 5 main hormones that work in this are aldosterone. So so you'll have covered that previously. That's all part of the renin-angiotensin, which is also here aldosterone system. So aldosterone works there, angiotensin works there. Antidiuretic hormone. So that, I'll tell you that now because I've got a question on in a second. So if you don't know, antidiuretic hormone from its very name is antidiuretic in its very nature, so it makes you wee less. And actually what it does, it reabsorbs water back into the body from the distal tubules and the collecting ducts. Okay, keep that in your head. You've got atrial natriuretic peptide. Again, from its name, you should be able to work out what it does. It's released from the atria, hence the name. It's natriuretic, so think about the Na that's there, sodium, so it causes the weeing out of sodium. What follows sodium osmotically? Water. So it kind of causes you to release or increase your urine volume. And then you've got parathyroid hormone. I touched on that earlier. That is involved in the reabsorption of calcium at the distal convoluted tubules and the excretion of phosphate. So phosphate, PTH, reabsorbs calcium so that we have more of it in the body and kicks out phosphate so that we have less of it in the body. So a little bit of a question for you. If we were to inject you with ADH, be a bit nasty, but if we were to inject you with ADH, what would happen to your plasma volume and osmolarity and your urine volume and osmolarity? So I want you to press pause, have a think about it. You've just been given a high dose of ADH. What's happening? Okay, so you're injected with ADH. ADH works on the distal tubules and the collecting ducts, and it's involved in water reabsorption. So at those levels, it reabsorbs water back into the blood. So therefore, your plasma volume goes up because you brought more water into it. And because you brought more water into it, you've diluted it. So the osmolarity goes down. So what about the urine? Well, you stopped, less water is now going into the urine, so the urine volume goes down and the urine osmolarity goes up because there's less water in it, so it's become more concentrated. Okay, so let's just do a couple of review questions at this stage. So press pause, have a read, have a think. Right, a 50-year-old man is taken to the emergency department after experiencing severe dehydration. His kidneys are actively working to conserve water and maintain electrolyte balance. Which kidney function is primarily responsible for this response? So what this is really asking you is, what is kicking in more than what is just regularly happening anyway? So what is being stimulated in in excess of what might be happening under normal circumstances. So hopefully you have said C, tubular reabsorption in the distal tubules and collecting ducts. Glomerular filtration is happening anyway. Tubular secretion in the proximal tubules happening anyway. Active transport in the loop of Henle happening anyway, and we're excreting waste E anyway. What you're doing in C is the hormones are kicking in to actively work to conserve water and maintain electrolytes. So ADH is being secreted and acting on the distal tubules. Aldosterone is being secreted and acting on the distal tubules. Okay, so that is what is happening at that point. It's being stimulated, it's being actively working. So what I'd like you to do now, we have covered all of this. I want you to look at the image on the left. So it's showing the structure of the tubules and the vascular components of a nephron. You've seen it before, it's in an earlier image. In this table, I want you to just, in a kind of a few words, just summarize what the main role of each structure is. I've done the first one for you. Afferent arteriole carries blood into the glomerulus. Next step, what's the glomerulus? What's it doing? Okay, so press pause, work your way through it, and then I will give you a brief overview. Okay, so here's your image on the left-hand side. Your afferent arteriole, follow the little arrow as we've said, is delivering blood into the glomerulus. Once inside the glomerulus, or what is the glomerulus is a more accurate way of putting it, it's a tuft of capillaries, and those capillaries filter the blood. Okay, so we're making our filtrate that goes into the Bowman's capsule and then into the proximal tubule. So what is the efferent arteriole? Here it is coming out of the glomerulus, so it carries blood out of the glomerulus. Peritubular capillaries, what are they? They are all of these things that are wrapped around the tubular components. So they are capillaries. What are they doing? They're supplying renal tissue with blood and nutrients, and they're exchanging fluid with filtrates. They're taking the things out of the filtrate back into the blood that we need and excreting waste products that we don't need into the tubular components. So we've now made our filtrate and it's entered the proximal tubule. How much was that again? How much do we make in health per minute? 100 mils per minute. Hope you got it. So, proximal tubule. What does that do? That's the filtrate coming in at 100 mils per minute. It's high capacity or bulk reabsorption and secretion of selected substances. Can you remember how much is being reabsorbed in the proximal tubule? Hopefully it's 70%, or that's what you remembered. Roughly 70% of sodium, potassium, chloride, and water is reabsorbed there. All of the amino acids and all of the glucose in health. We then move our way through the proximal tubules where this is all happening. We come down to the loop of Henle. Remember, we've got descending loop and the ascending loop. But what's its overall function? It establishes an osmotic gradient for concentrating the tubular fluid. So overall, even though different things are happening in the descending and ascending loop, we're starting to concentrate this fluid, this filtrate. We then come into the distal tubules and the collecting ducts. Remember, that's where the hormones are acting, and this is where you're getting that variable control, that reabsorption of things and the secretion of things that we need and the things that we don't need. Can you remember what those hormones are, or what any of them are, that are acting at this distal tubule and collecting duct? Hopefully you're remembering aldosterone, that reabsorbs sodium and water follows it osmotically. Just so you know, it also kicks out or secretes hydrogen and potassium ions, so keep that in your head as well. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, reabsorbs water. Parathyroid hormone, reabsorbs calcium, kicks out phosphate. ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, kicks out sodium, water follows, so we out sodium with water. Okay, and finally, the last little bit, this is the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Remember what this is? It's both tubular in nature, because it's detecting what's in the distal tubule, and it's vascular in nature, because it's communicating with both the afferent and the efferent arterioles. So it's this little region, lots of different types of cells there doing lots of different things. But the whole point is it's communicating. So it's helping to regulate glomerular filtration rate, regulate blood pressure by controlling renin, remember part of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, but also afferent arteriole vasoconstriction and dilation, and to a lesser extent efferent dilation and constriction. Hopefully you got all of that. And if you got all of that, you know the kidney. So, last few slides, we're just going to test you on your knowledge. What do you know? What can you remember? So press pause, have a read, and then we shall go through it. Okay, a 24-year-old man goes to his GP with muscle weakness for the last couple of weeks. Blood tests show a plasma potassium concentration of 6.2 millimoles per litre, which is above the reference range. Further investigations show that he doesn't have high enough aldosterone levels, so his aldosterone is low, which is the normal effect of aldosterone on potassium handling by the kidney. Okay, I did mention this in the last slide, so hopefully you can remember what it's doing. Okay, so hopefully you said D. It increases potassium secretion in the distal tubule. So it does that fine tuning. So aldosterone does a few things. 1, it reabsorbs sodium, water follows. 2, it increases potassium secretion. 3, it increases hydrogen ion secretion as well. Have those 3 things in your head and you've got aldosterone absolutely sorted.